welcome to Hoorick, Hoorah, Go Xavs Radio. On our program today, club legend Peter Rhoden. Peter Porky Rhoden is a name synonymous with old Xaverians football. He played for the club, coached the senior team and is a life member. That's a lot to cram into 65 years of service to the Red and Blacks. He joined us last week. Hello, Peter Rhoden, and welcome to Hoorick, Hoorah, Go Xavs Radio. We thought we'd start with you, Peter, given you've been around for a while, to go back and tell a bit of your story about how you first came to wear the red and black.
Well, I left Xavier in 1956, at the end of 1956, having played in the school first 18 for 3 years. I started off at a very tender age. I was picked to play in a practice match against Newman College at the age of 15, which was a bit of a surprise for me because I had my eyes set on playing the following year. However, that was the start of a rather enjoyable and, may I say, quite successful period of playing football at Xavier College. Fellows that I played with, Terry Callan and Neville Gibson, Peter Raphael, Peter Johnson, Peter Gillen, John Burns, Jim Boston, who's unfortunately now deceased, as have quite a few of the others. We had a very successful year, going through unbeaten in 1955 and losing only one game in 1956. So it was the start of Xavier's football supremacy, some people seem to think. Of course, those that played in that team would agree wholeheartedly that it was the start.
Did you join the old Xavs footy club immediately?
No, I didn't. I'd been invited to go down to play at Hawthorn, and so I played in some of their practice matches, but unfortunately I wasn't able to devote the time because I was playing in a final series in cricket for the Richmond second 11, and you know, when you're in the finals you seem to devote the time to that, and if we got washed out or had a game that finished early, I'd go and play in a practice match at Hawthorn. It only lasted for about 4 or 5 games, and then I got injured, and so I decided that it was much more important to earn a dollar and go and play football with the old Xavs and concentrate on my after-school study and my job.
So when you got out to the old Xavs, were there many of your old school teammates there, or?
No, there are a couple of them there that I recall. Gibson and Callan were there, but they were based at Newman, and a lot of the other players followed academic careers, doctors, dentists, and other professional men, and so didn't play amateur football. Some came a little bit later, fellas like Malone and Slattery and Greg Keogh, but I was with Gibson and Callan were probably the first two that came to play.
And what was the opportunity like at the old Xavs in those days in terms of numbers? Was there a reserves team or was it just the single team?
It was a long time before the reserves came into being. It was probably around about 1960, I think, when the reserves came in. Numbers weren't readily available to play on a Saturday. Lots of fellas were working on Saturday morning. Probably there were 23 to 24 to choose from. There were some fellas who played who weren't quite up to standard, but there were others who were above ability, which happened to get the side moving along into a reasonable situation.
And your spot in the team, where did you play, Peter?
A fellow called Ted Ryan was the coach, and he was a former Collingwood player, and I knew him through some friends of the family, and he came to me and said, I see you've always played centre-half back. Can you mark it and can you kick it? And I said, well, I can get it and I can kick it. He said, okay, we're going to play you on the forward line. Well, that was a joy for a start to not be a defender and to be an attacker. So I started playing on the half-forward line, and no pace, but ability to get the ball and to kick straight and long. But then when injuries occurred, I found myself being slotted back to playing on the back line. We're in a situation where defending was probably better than attacking, but I didn't quite agree with that, but I did what I was told.
You're a great exponent of the long raking drop kick, I understand.
Yes, it was my pride and joy, I suppose. A fellow called Jack Greenway, who played in those days, was a skinny fellow, quite a bit older than I was, and played on the wing. And we worked out this little plan that if I got it, he'd come forward and then stop and then go back. And I'd roost it over the back of his head, and he'd run onto the ball and kick it to the forward line.
Now, you mentioned injuries before, but your career ended prematurely with injury, I am.
Yes, it was rather unfortunate. We were playing rivals at that time, old Paradians, and we were playing at Olympic Park, which had I think it was a dog track around the outside or a bike track, but it was quite a good ground to play on. I shouldn't have been playing on the particular day because I had an injured ankle, but Capes pulled out at the last minute, and the coach asked me if I would play, and I said, well, I'll do my best. That wasn't the reason I had my jaw broken. I could see the ball coming. I was positioning. I could see the players coming towards me, and it was either get out of the way or mark the ball. And get out of the way wasn't my way of playing. So marked the ball, got hit in the jaw, and they took the ball off me and escorted me from the field with a broken jaw in two places.
And so that was it. Never played again.
That was it as far as playing with the old Xavs were concerned, yes.
So after you finished playing, did you stay with the old Xavs or did you take a bit of time out? Because, of course, in 1962, you became the 19th coach of the old Xavs.
So if I was coaching 1962, I must have broken my jaw in 61. I spent part of 61. Alan Dwyer, who was a stalwart of the Old Xaverians Football Club, had a boy at Cosca, and whilst I had my jaw broken, wired up, Alan convinced me it'd be nice to go down to Cosca and umpire games on a Saturday morning. Whilst my jaw was broken, I could still put air into the whistle. So that was probably my starting career, recruiting young fellas to come and play with the old Xavs. So the boys at Cosca appreciated the fact that I was down there umpiring games on a Saturday morning, and sometimes I go to Burke Hall and do it too. And so they got interested in following the form of the old Xavs. And of course, at that stage, umpiring, I had no idea that I'd be coached the next year, but I sort of encouraged the boys to play Old Xaverians football when their time came.
Of course, that year of 62, when you took over as coach, immediate success because the club won the B section premiership.
Yeah, we had a fairly good side, and I often think that sometimes new coaches breathe new life into clubs. I applied for the job thinking that I may get it. Previous coach was Jack Gaffney, who coached a bit in the amateurs and played league football for Fitzroy. And so I thought, oh, well, I'll have a crack at it anyway. And one of the questions was, how will you go giving orders to players like Capes, Gibson, Callan, etc., who you've been a player with? And I said, I think they probably respect my point of view and respect my ability to pass the message on. And they were convinced of that. So that was the start of a most enjoyable period as coach of the Old Xaverians Football Club.
Now, you were there for 7 seasons as senior coach, and certainly the best result was in A section in 1964 when the club failed by just a few points to take its first A section premiership.
Again, a grand final against Old Paradians, our dreaded enemy. Yeah, we were a bit unlucky on that day, I suppose. We had plenty of opportunities. Probably what cost us the game may have been the fact that Peter Slattery got glandular fever on the week prior to the grand final, and he had to be replaced with a player of lesser ability. Well, those of us that were involved in that team would think if Slattery had played, we would have won. However, it was a fairly good result to finish second in spite of the disappointment.
In the years following that, there was a gradual slide there. In 1965, finished 6th, then 8th in 66, and relegated, finishing in 9th position in 67. And then in 68, your last season, 6th place finish in B section. And then, of course, the club didn't see A section again until 1981. What happened there?
Probably they kept the coach for too many years, I would think, in retrospect. It might have been good to have got a new coach. However, the coaches that followed me didn't have much success, and the club got a little bit carried away with wanting to get people who had league experience to come and coach the club. And there's a big difference between that and amateur football, particularly in those days. Not so much today, particularly in those days, is that they didn't quite understand it, that you had to get inside the head and get the love of the players to follow the coach.
There was always tension within the old Xavs about whether players who didn't attend the school should be eligible to play for the team. That raged on and off for quite a while.
The club constitution said that you had to go to Xavier to be a member of the Old Xaverians Football Club. in spite of the fact that in 40s there were two non-Xaverians, but they got through because would have had to forfeit games if these two guys hadn't played. One example was a fellow called Jeff Hickey, who was a very good player at University Blues. His father went to Xavier, who was an amateur and who'd finished with the Blues and wanted to come and play with the old Xavs. But the Constitution, and my dear friend Alan Dwyer is a very strong man for the Constitution. He made sure that that wasn't going to happen. However, in years to come, as we know, the club has welcomed non-old Xavs with open arms, and some of the fellows that have played with the old Xavs in recent times who didn't go to the school have been as good as you could ever expect as clubmen.
Back in your coaching time, and in those subsequent years, how rough was the VAFA footy?
I'd say A and B grade was fairly good, or fairly played. The lower grades there was quite a deal of biff going on. Fellows would get reported for striking and get 6 to 8 weeks. Ian Johnson, the famous Test cricketer and MCC secretary, was chair of the tribunal in those days, and he was fairly stringent. Look, the game was hard. There were plenty of knocks. There was not much medical attention. So if you got knocked, you got up and kept playing. They had a St John's ambulance man there who they paid each week to look after the old Xavs, but I don't think he was much good other than have a drink and rub a bit of this on it, son, and you'll be all right.
Back in '64, the reserves won the flag, of course. And I just wanted to know, because that was the early times for the reserves competition. Was there much interchange between the ones and twos in those days, or was the twos a contract team, a bit like the Crocs have become over the years?
Oh, no, the reserves were a fairly good team. They were strong, but a lot of the players that played in the reserve side at that stage were university students who were studying, who didn't have time to train, and so their fitness levels were always left a little bit undernourished in terms of coming to play senior football. But fellas, I think of blokes like John Dowling and Peter Fraser, and perhaps better known players like Gavin Woodruff and Peter Stanley. They came up and down. Probably Woodruff was the only one that stayed for any length of time in the seniors. A lot of it was up, and our player had come up because of someone was injured. But generally speaking, we had the same 20 each week.
Of course, it was 20 in those days, thankfully, to be able to fill the team, because I presume that certainly in your early days with the club that a lot of players didn't have cars, and it was a lot more difficult to get to training and to get to game.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, when Des Maher started training with us at Xavier, he was a student at the pharmacy college, and we'd finished training at, say, 6:15, 7:15, and Des had arrived, and so, I'd be out in the ground with Des and kicking the ball backwards and forwards and giving him ball drills, etc. Capes, for example, would be on duty at the hospital and come and train, and then wouldn't even bother having a shower, just put something on and then drove back to St V's to do his rounds at the hospital. There were wool buyers and guys who were away in the country quite a deal. So that was a bit of a problem. Probably the interesting thing by comparison is in those days, the standard of the umpiring, there was only one umpire, one central umpire. The boundary umpires and the goal umpires were both supplied by the clubs. You went into a game with 20 players, one goal umpire and one boundary umpire. So you had 20 players who wanted to play and two guys who would have liked to have been playing, but I don't know about happy to do the job of boundary umpire and goal umpiring and timekeeping and that sort of thing. There weren't the numbers about to choose from that there are in the 2000s.
Some of the better players that you coached, Peter, in your time at the club?
Gibson was very good, Raphael Johnson, Malone, Peter Gillen, Richard Day, John Burns. They were all very, very good players that I coached. Cape and Maher, of course. At various times I had Trevor Gowes for a while. I had some other boys that played with the school, and I would make a point of trying to play two players from the school team at the end of the season in the seniors in the hope that they would get a taste of old Xavs football. One in particular was a fellow called Des Steele, who went on to play at Collingwood. John Lilly went on to play a few games at St Kilda. Michael Johnson, Sammy Johnson's father, who became a stalwart for the club. John Sanders, of course, who was a very close friend of mine, was captain, and Greg Gibson. We were associated for Gibson and Sanders, and Tully and I were very close friends as well as being players who played under me. To their credit, they knew that I was the coach, and however, quite often there was some stern conversations with Anthony George Capes as to as a medical doctor as to where he should play on wet days. However, he was that bloody good, it didn't matter.
Michael Mulcahy, who won the Woodrow Medal, of course.
Mull was a young fellow who had come from Cosca originally up to Xavier, and he had a thirst for football and cricket, and he was an excellent player, and it was a joy to coach him and as team captain. A great thrill for Mulcahy and for Mitch McKenzie. I mean, over the period of time, you sort of lose track of some of the superstars. One bloke who wasn't mentioned was Greg Keogh, and when he came back from the university, he was a wonderful player too. But he was, again, another doctor in the team. After you retired from coaching, the new coaching setup certainly didn't resurrect the club, because the drought really lasted until 1976. And by that stage, the old Xavs were in D section. And thankfully then won another premiership. It was the first since 1962, so that was I suppose by old Xaverian standards in those times, it wasn't that significant a drought. There were obviously some factors in the decline, and I wonder whether it was this social unrest at the time where amateur football became perhaps less important for a lot of people, or whether it was just mistakes made by the club. I think a lot of the downhill slide was lack of interest from those people that had been involved in the club in the success days. In case I sort of not withdrew from Xaverians football, but I started playing tennis on a Saturday, and then going to the game after the tennis was over, and really felt that those that were running the club should be allowed to run it the way they thought best, and not to interfere. However, my former captain and great mate, John Sanders, thought that this was not the case, and so he got involved, and he was certainly started the revival, and assisted by Jack Bowen as to pulling the socks up and getting back to where the club ought to be, and continued on to where it is today. My understanding was that it was around about that time that there was some very serious recruiting done from within the school in an attempt to make sure that more players came through and became old Xaverians after wearing the red and black at school. Sanders and Jack Batten and Richard Cooksley and others, and Jack, I think they decided that that's where the good players were, and they were going to go and start and cultivate that area of recruitment. And it started off slowly but surely, and then we got, Cooksley was a good player. Then, we had the Michael Rushes, and then slowly but surely Nick Byrne and these guys. Players to come to a club, they want to know that they want to feel that it is successful, they are going to be successful, and they are going to help it on the way. And that's the message that they sold, and that's how these fellas came, and that was the start of getting back to where it is today. Yes, well, of course, after the D section premiership, the club raced back up the grades, winning B grade in 1980, and then under Michael Green, and then won again the first A section flag ever in 1981. There was an example of Michael Green was a wonderful coach, had gone to the school for 2 years, had played league football, was up to date with the modern methods, knew the kids who were at school, had sons who were players, and got the taste of wanting to be a successful coach. And he was wonderful via, I don't know who got him, whether David Burns or somebody else got him involved in the club, maybe Jack, but he did an exceptional job. And to have somebody who's standing coaching the old Xaverians, that attracted people from outside. There were 2 relegations post the 1981 success, but then when the club came back, unparalleled success beginning in 1995 and concluding in 2000 with 6 straight A-section premierships, which
A lot of people thought that that was probably the end, but things have carried on since then, not as consistently, but certainly the club has reached the pinnacle on a number of occasions since the end of that run. That must have been a tremendous time to be around the club during that straight six.
Oh, it was unbelievable. Absolutely. I mean, to go to Elsternwick Park in September, you knew two things. One, you were going to get a bit of wind, and the other, you were going to go home. I mean, look at the crowds of Elsternwickers that were there to watch those games. A period that certainly woke other clubs in the VAFA as to how to become successful. Success follows success follows success. It's just one of those things. I can remember when I started work at Xavier and addressing the prefects at a meeting, one of the kids asked me some sort of a question related to my football experiences, and I said, I just demand a hands up all those boys that play Aussie rules football, and 60% of them put their hands up, and how many of you are going to intend to go and play with the Elsternwick Football Club, and about 80%. So there were kids putting their hands up that didn't even play footy, but they wanted to be part of that Elsternwick Football Club story.
Peter, for your extraordinary service to the club, you were awarded life membership. Do you remember which year that was?
I've been trying to work it out, but it was somewhere in the 70s, the late 70s. The club also had a rule in the constitution that a page 7 of the club couldn't be awarded life membership, and I'd resigned myself to the fact that it was never going to happen. Anyway, we went off to a function at the Crown Casino one night. I think it was Michael Rush was talking. In retrospect, it was Michael Rush. My wife turned to me and she said, do you know who he's talking about? She said, I think it's you, isn't it? And then he got down to the numbers of games and years and service, etc., and probably not as good as a premiership, but nearly as good as a premiership. And I certainly cherish that life membership.
And you've also had a pretty serious role at the VAFA. You're a life member there, and you were the representative team coach and also formed part of the tribunal.
Yeah, I was when I'd finished at old Xavs, I had a year coaching St Kevin's, who were in D grade, who'd got caught short for a coach, Ross Oakley, of AFL fame afterwards, but he'd been moved to London, and start of the season they didn't have a coach, and that was a lot of fun. But after that, I then served on the umpires appointments board of the amateurs, and from there in 1984 I was asked if I'd sit on the tribunal, which I thought, oh yes, it'd be nice to give something back, and so I sat on the tribunal from 1984 to 2014. After about 5 or 6 years, I was made one of the 5 chairmen of the tribunal, along with 4 other people who were magistrates, and I think they might have got me confused with my cousin, who was a solicitor, and thought I had a legal background. But I really enjoyed it, and it was nice to be giving something back. It was also, nice to keep in touch with what was going on in amateur football.
Well, you're still very active at the old Xavs, appearing at many games when you can on that, oftentimes on that fabulous shooting stick of yours. And you've seen a lot of changes since you first watched the club and played for the club. Perhaps the biggest change of all has been the introduction of women's footy. What's your view on the Woks?
I must confess that I was very surprised when they talked about running the women's team. My main concern was where would they get the helpers. Once they started, I was very keen to do something, but circumstances didn't allow me to do that. And then I had a granddaughter who started playing. She wasn't, she didn't have her grandfather's skills, unfortunately, but I just got so interested in watching the kids play. And also, one night I was at Xavier, and the women were training on the main oval, and the main team were training on the Plunket. And I saw this tsunami of girls in old Xavs jumpers running from the main oval across to the Plunket. And I thought, my God, who would ever have thought that had happened? And it's wonderful the way it's happened. The enthusiasm is sensational, and I wholly support it, because I think it's one of the best. It's a great injection into our club to have all these girls involved, and their enthusiasm I admire greatly.
Okay, Peter. Well, we hope to see you very shortly at the football. And thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Michael.
Club legend Peter Porky Rhoden.